Some names survive the test of time not because of what they left behind, but because of what they made disappear. Thus begins one of the most uncomfortable accounts preserved in the Holleridge District Archives, dated 1874, when the county was still a jumble of dirt roads, weathered wooden houses, and families trying to survive overly long winters. Among these pages, stained by weather and handling, one name reappears with disturbing consistency: Margaret Redwhisper, the soft-spoken widow who lived near the old Red Cedar Ravine, a region that, decades later, would lend her the nickname that would span generations. The official story describes Margaret as a reserved woman, almost invisible in the daily life of the village. Her husband, Elijah Redwhisper, had died 3 winters earlier, supposedly from pneumonia, leaving her only a small property, a barn, a stone cellar, and a reputation built on silence. Records from the time speak of a thin woman with a stern expression, always dressed in dark clothes, unable, according to later accounts, to raise her voice above a whisper. For some, it was just prolonged mourning. For others, a kind of religious austerity bordering on fanaticism. The village of Holleridge in those years consisted of little more than 80 families. Most survived on manual labor, agriculture, delivery carts, hunting, and small trades. Summer mornings were filled with the sound of axes chopping wood, horses crossing the mud, and children collecting water from community wells. But whenever the name Redwhisper was mentioned, the tone changed, not out of explicit fear, but out of a prudent moral distance. Margaret was seen as disciplined, rigid, faithful to personal rituals that no one dared to question. She attended church, but always sat in the back pew, her hands clasped and her gaze fixed on the floor. No one knew for sure what went on behind the thick walls of her house. The few visitors who recorded their impressions of her describe an environment that was too clean, too quiet, where the air seemed heavy even during the warm months. The basement, later nicknamed by investigators as the Forced Prayers Basement, was simply noted as a lower stone compartment, limited ventilation, access through reinforced door. Nothing more. On old maps, it is just an unmarked square, a dark area on the yellowed drawing of the terrain. The community treated her with polite caution, nods, quick conversations, a certain respect for the suffering of an isolated widow. But there was something in the reports that suggested that mourning was not the only thing weighing on that house. The older neighbors mentioned muffled noises in the late afternoon, slow footsteps, the scraping of wood, prayers murmured with a strange cadence, as if they had been imposed and not chosen. Nothing was said openly, and no one dared to confront her. In small places, silence often serves both to preserve and to hide. In the archives of 1874, however, the name Redwhisper ceases to be just a marginal note and takes center stage in a set of documents that, taken together, form the basis of this account. They are testimonies, letters from the county, missing persons reports, and loose notes from residents who preferred not to sign their accounts. Everything revolves around a sequence of events that began almost imperceptibly. Young workers, lone travelers, and men looking for odd jobs who simply did not return to their lodgings. The official number, confirmed by the authorities at the time, was 18 missing persons, all men, all last seen in the vicinity of the widow's house. At first glance, it seemed like a coincidence. The path that passed in front of the property was used by travelers in search of food, water, or brief rest. But the pattern repeated itself with uncomfortable precision. Each missing man was seen, according to witnesses, talking briefly with Margaret, or at least passing by the side fence of her property. There were no reported assaults, no screams, no commotion. Just absences that, when added up, began to form a pattern impossible to ignore. And this is where the archives reveal their first truly strange detail. An anonymous note, written in shaky handwriting, with no exact date, found among the records of the local church. The sentence, short and almost illegible, simply read, "They went down praying." No other document explains what this means. No testimony identifies who wrote it. But this phrase, Simple, enigmatic, isolated, marks the exact point where the story ceases to be just the quiet life of an isolated widow and becomes one of the most disturbing cases in the region. And, according to what remains on record, this is precisely where the mystery begins. Before any disappearance, even before the first rumors, Margaret Redwhisper seemed just another one of the many people shaped by the harshness of that time. To understand what came next, it is necessary to carefully reconstruct what is known: scattered fragments, surviving memories, and small records that reveal the daily life of that silent woman. According to documents found in the county clerk's office, Margaret was 37 years old in 1874. She had lived alone since her husband's death, and loneliness seemed to have taken root in her routine as an inevitable habit. She always woke up before sunrise, lit the kitchen lamp, prepared a hot barley mixture, and inspected the vegetable garden. She was seen carrying buckets of water from the well, chopping wood with short, precise movements, and cleaning the small shed at the back of the property. For most, it was just discipline, the kind of methodical and hard life that the period demanded. But some witnesses from that time, quoted in later reports, describe something peculiar. Margaret seemed to organize her day around the basement. There were specific times when she would disappear inside, taking with her jugs of water or a notebook or simply nothing. It was such a constant habit that some neighbors, passing by in the distance, would mark the time by the widow's routine. In a 1911 testimony, a former resident recalls that the basement was the only place where she did not lock the door to the house. The rest was always locked. Another witness described that the door leading to the underground space was always clean, as if it were used with unusual frequency. The widow's relationship with the residents was cordial, but never intimate. Children avoided walking down the road after dark, not because they were afraid of the widow, but because of the silence that hung over the property, a silence so concentrated that it seemed to absorb the sounds of the surroundings. Adults, when they met her at the market or church, treated her with respect but rarely engaged her in conversation. Some said she had a gaze that seemed to pierce through people. Others claimed she was just shy, crushed by grief. Margaret's husband, Elijah, was described as a strict, deeply religious man who, according to church records, maintained very severe domestic discipline practices. There are scattered reports of mandatory prayers, prolonged fasts, and spiritual corrections applied within the home, a euphemism used at the time to describe physical punishment justified by religious pretexts. What is unclear in the archives is whether Margaret shared these beliefs or simply endured them in silence. When Elijah died, the local reverend recorded that she did not cry at the funeral. She simply kept her hands clasped and her head bowed throughout the ceremony. Still, from accounts obtained decades later, it seems that there was a moment when the widow's routine began to suffer small distortions, subtle marks that only became relevant when the disappearances came to light. One such sign is in an 1873 letter written by a neighbor, Sarah Whitcomb, who described seeing Margaret walking late at night along the side of the house, carrying a lamp and what looked like a small Bible. Sarah mentions that the widow seemed to be murmuring prayers, but the strange thing is that she walked in circles, repeatedly as if following a ritual. Another testimony, recorded many years later by a former milkman, reports that he heard faint voices coming from inside the property, although he saw no one but Margaret. At the time, he believed he was hearing the echo of the widow herself praying, something common for those who faced long periods of isolation. But this detail, in light of subsequent events, would again be cited as circumstantial evidence. The men who disappeared, workers from neighboring farms, lone travelers, small vendors, were, for the most part, unknown to the community. Some had arrived a few days earlier, others were just passing through. There was no direct connection between them, no obvious pattern other than the fact that they were adult men and were near the Redwhisper property. The absence of a clear motive was precisely what confused the initial attempts at investigation. But there is one detail that recurs in several statements. Many of these men were seen talking to Margaret shortly before they disappeared. Not long conversations, not warm interactions, just brief exchanges of words. A glass of water offered, directions given, a request for help moving something heavy. In all cases, these were brief encounters, but enough to mark the beginning of their last confirmed appearances. And according to preserved documents, there was something else. Some residents reported that, in the days leading up to each disappearance, the widow seemed more tense, more introspective, and spent hours in the basement, as if she were preparing something. A neighbor claimed to have seen the light of a lamp flickering through the small underground ventilation shaft long after the village usually went to sleep. Historians who later analyzed the case noted that these signs, taken in isolation, might not mean anything. Life was hard, loneliness was common, and peculiar behavior was not uncommon in such austere times. But when each piece is put in its proper place, a picture begins to emerge. A silent, tense, and deeply unsettling picture. And it is precisely when this picture begins to form that the next chapter of the story approaches. The days leading up to the first officially recorded disappearance. Official records indicate that the first disappearance directly linked to the Redwhisper estate occurred in the second week of October 1874. Shortly after sunset, when the Holleridge Hills were already gripped by a bitter cold and the mist that usually rose from the streams at dusk. The man in question was Thomas Hale, a migrant worker in his early 30s, last seen walking with a small cloth bag and asking, according to witnesses, where he could spend the night. The most complete account of Thomas comes from a diary found decades later, written by a young resident who saw him passing by on the road. He describes a tired man, his face marked by dust and lack of rest, someone who was clearly just looking for a safe place to shelter. And it was in this condition that he was last seen talking to Margaret Redwhisper, who was in front of her property gathering firewood. According to the testimony of a neighbor, Ellen Whitcomb, Margaret offered the traveler water. There is no evidence that he entered the house at that moment, only that he remained for a few minutes near the side fence, leaning in to listen to something the widow was saying in her usual low voice. After that, Thomas continued along the main road, or at least that was what was believed until he simply never arrived anywhere. The days leading up to the disappearance are referred to in several documents as inexplicably quiet. Residents report that the Redwhisper property seemed more closed off than usual. The widow was not seen at church, did not go to the market, and lit the kitchen lamp earlier than usual. A delivery man claimed to have heard slow, steady footsteps coming from the basement in the middle of the morning, something unusual as Margaret usually reserved that space for specific times. But none of this attracted immediate attention. It was all part of small details that would only become relevant later. On the night of her disappearance, weather records indicate a heavy, almost starless sky, with gusts of wind blowing through the cracks in the houses like long moans. Holleridge went to bed early, and so few noticed any unusual activity. Only one resident, a farmer named Andrew Cole, reported seeing a lamp lit in the widow's basement in the middle of the night, flickering as if someone were pacing back and forth. Thomas Hale, meanwhile, was last seen about 20 minutes before that time. A witness, a boy carrying milk to the barn, said he saw the man standing in front of the Redwhisper fence, as if trying to decide whether to ask for shelter. There is no consensus on whether he actually knocked on the door, but the boy claims to have seen Margaret inside, holding the lamp, as if waiting for something. From this point on, the information becomes fragmented, but there is a probable sequence, reconstructed from multiple documents. Thomas approaches the side door. The widow opens it, as if she were already waiting. A detail mentioned in 2 reports, both anonymous. A brief exchange of words. The lamp disappears from the window. Absolute silence. None of the neighbors reported any screams, commotion, or sudden movements that night. Everything indicates that the disappearance occurred quietly, almost carefully. It is this silence, more than any action, that intrigues historians to this day. The basement, which would later be called the Forced Prayers Basement, appears for the first time in the records at this stage of the investigation. A police document dated November mentions signs of recent use, wood scratches at the entrance, and the smell of melted wax impregnated in the walls. 3 witnesses stated that around that week they heard something like murmured prayers, repeated at regular intervals, but none of them could identify whether they came from inside the house or the basement area. It is important to note that, at the time, prayers were part of the routine of many families. What made these strange was their rhythm, slow, cadenced, almost imposed, as if they were recited not out of devotion, but out of necessity. The critical point of the climax appears in a report by the local reverend, written weeks later. He mentions finding Margaret in church with her hands covered in small red marks, as if she had held rough ropes or rough wood for too long. When asked, she simply replied in a low voice, "Housework." It was also during this period that the following disappearances began to occur. 2 men, a traveler named Joseph Tanner and a barn hand named William Street, were last seen passing by the Redwhisper property. Both had mentioned to the local market that they intended to go to the end of the road, but neither completed the journey. Reports from neighbors became more frequent and more sinister. One woman claimed to have seen the silhouette of a man descending the basement stairs, followed by Margaret. Another witness said she heard muffled prayers that did not seem to come from a single person. Although this detail has never been confirmed, it appears in 3 different testimonies, separated by years. The most disturbing document, and the most discussed by historians, is a loose sheet found in the archives of the old county school. Written by a teacher who lived near the property, it contains only the following note: "Her lamp no longer goes out." As the days passed, the pattern became too clear to ignore. All the missing men had been seen in some way in the vicinity of the widow's house, often at times when she was near the basement entrance. However, the last known piece of evidence, the one that ends this excerpt and pushes the case toward a decisive turning point, appears in the police files from December. It is a simple hand-drawn map representing the floor plan of the Redwhisper house. The basement appears as a shaded rectangle, and just above it, a note written in pencil: "There's too much space here." The document does not explain the meaning of this sentence. It does not describe what was found. It does not indicate who made the note, but it is precisely where the climax ends, and where Holleridge finally realizes that something was deeply wrong. By the time the county finally recognized that the disappearances had a pattern and that the Redwhisper property appeared in almost every report, it was too late. Holleridge, once a village of predictable routine, plunged into an atmosphere of stifled tension. Families locked their doors before sunset. Men avoided traveling alone. Women whispered among themselves at the market, exchanging rumors that grew faster than evidence. The first official move was a visit from the local sheriff, Daniel Crowder, accompanied by 2 deputies. The report describes Margaret receiving the 3 with unusual serenity. She opened the door with her hands clasped, invited them in, and offered them fresh water, showing no discomfort with their presence. The sheriff noted that she answered all questions objectively, almost coldly, without hesitation. She said she had not seen any of the missing men. She claimed that, as always, she worked alone and did not receive visitors. Nothing in her tone suggested contradiction, but something caught his attention: the basement. When Crowder asked to inspect the house, the widow agreed as long as he did not disrupt her personal belongings. The rooms were immaculate, the kitchen tidy, the living room sterile. But when they reached the door leading to the underground space, Margaret hesitated for the first time. The sheriff describes how she placed her hand on the doorknob as if touching something fragile. She said that the basement was under construction, that it was not safe to enter, and that she would prefer to show him the place another day, after cleaning it properly. That was the first contradiction. Crowder respected her request, but left the house convinced that there was something to investigate. 2 days later, he returned, this time without warning, and found the basement door locked with an additional lock that had not been there on his previous visit. From that point on, the community was divided. Some defended the widow, claiming she was just a lonely woman, the target of unfair suspicion. Others believed that the silence of the house hid something that needed to be revealed. Rumors spread. Some said they heard muffled cries. Others said that the widow performed prayers of discipline. a legacy from the time of Elijah. None of these rumors were officially confirmed, but they all contributed to the atmosphere of unease. The situation worsened when a new clue emerged, a small piece of fabric found by a hunter at the back of the Redwhisper property. The material matched the description of the shirt worn by one of the missing persons. The object was taken to the sheriff, who returned to the house accompanied by 2 other men. Margaret, upon opening the door, remained calm, but this time refused to let them in, stating that they were accusing her without evidence and demanding respect. Crowder, however, insisted. The report describes a tense conversation, but without aggression. The widow eventually gave in, allowing them to enter as long as everything was handled with care. It was during this visit that investigators found the first concrete evidence: drag marks on the wooden floor leading to the basement door. They were not large or obvious marks, but they were noticeable enough to those looking for clues. The door, which was locked again, had recent scratches on the bottom, as if something had been pressed against it. Margaret explained that they were old marks, the result of transporting boxes and bags of grain. But the sheriff noted that the wood looked freshly marked. Still, without a formal warrant, they could not proceed. Days later, the tension reached its peak when 3 residents, who preferred to remain anonymous, claimed to have heard repeated prayers coming from the basement around midnight. The report describes muffled male voices, followed by long periods of silence. One of the witnesses, an elderly woman, said she knelt in the dark, believing she was hearing souls in penance. Another said she did not sleep that night, waiting for sounds that never came. These statements, though ambiguous, were enough for the sheriff to finally request authorization from the county for a full inspection. The request was approved after 24 hours, but when Crowder and his deputies arrived at the Redwhisper house the next morning, they found the front door open, the rooms empty, and the kitchen lamp still on, a detail that would become something of a symbol of the case. Margaret was nowhere to be found. There were no signs of a struggle, no objects out of place, just the feeling that she had left minutes before, as if she had been warned of the investigators' arrival. The inspection then focused on the basement. The additional lock had been removed, but the door was only ajar. The sheriff describes that when he pushed it open, a thick smell of dampness and old wax escaped, filling the air. The underground space was larger than the map suggested, with stone walls, uneven floors, and a row of makeshift benches leaning against the wall. There were also knee marks on the floor, deep marks, as if someone had been there for long periods of time. In the center of the basement, investigators found a set of objects arranged in an almost ritualistic manner. A small Bible open to passages of penance, a half-full jug of water, and worn ropes with broken fibers. There were no bodies, no blood, no direct evidence of violence. But there was something more disturbing. 18 names written on the wall, some complete, others just initials. Among them was Thomas Hale. Subsequent investigations only confirmed what was already suspected. There, in that cold and silent space, men had been forced to remain in a position of prayer. It is not known for how long, nor under what conditions. The lack of physical remains prevented any definitive conclusion. No bodies were found, no traces beyond the marks and notes. The Hollow Ridge community was divided between outrage, fear, and disbelief. To some, Margaret was a fanatic influenced by the harsh methods of her late husband. To others, she was a woman broken by loneliness who projected a distorted ideal of purification onto the travelers. To most, she was simply an enigma. And it was only then, when it was believed that nothing more could emerge, that the sheriff found a small folded piece of paper in the corner of the basement. On it, written in Margaret's tiny slanted handwriting, was the phrase, "They needed to learn to pray." No explanation, no signature, no date. It was the only revelation left by the widow before she disappeared without a trace. Today, almost a century and a half after the events of 1874, the case of the widow Redwhisper remains an unhealed wound in the historical memory of Hollow Ridge. Much has changed since those days. Houses have been rebuilt, new generations have occupied the hills, and the old dusty road no longer exists as it once did. But in the archives, preserved in wooden boxes, on papers yellowed by time, there still lies the unease left behind by Margaret and the 18 men who never returned. Scholars who revisit the case immediately recognize the strange feeling that surrounds it. There are no definitive conclusions, no concrete evidence, not even a body to seal the outcome. All that remains are fragments, marks on the ground, names scribbled on the wall, contradictory testimonies, silences that were never filled. And above all, the figure of the widow herself, not as a monster nor as a martyr, but as something much more disturbing. An ordinary woman, living in a harsh era, overcome by beliefs and pains that perhaps even she did not fully understand. It is this aspect that most challenges historians, the absence of a clear motive. There is no evidence of material gain, revenge, or calculated cruelty. The clues point at best to a pattern of penance, discipline, and rituality, practices that may have sprung from a mind marked by years of isolation and influenced by a rigidly devout husband. But none of these hypotheses holds up completely. The widow was too reserved, too silent, too impenetrable for anyone to really say who she was behind her restrained expression and rigid posture. Over the decades, the basement of the Redwhisper property was dismantled, and its stones were reused in the construction of a nearby barn. Some long-time residents say that the place was never the same again, not because of hauntings, but because of the uncomfortable feeling that something deeply human and deeply tragic had happened there. It wasn't fear of the supernatural. It was respect for something that was never fully understood. Among historians, there is a silent consensus that Margaret did not run away. If she had tried to escape, she would likely have been seen on one of the roads connecting Holleridge to neighboring counties. But there are no records. There are no sightings. She simply disappeared in the same way as the missing men, swallowed up by the emptiness of the borders and the silence of an era when traces were easily lost. The descendants of the families involved, both those who disappeared and those who witnessed it, rarely talk about the case. Some preserve letters and notes as bitter relics, others prefer to forget. Sheriff Crowder, in his final notes years later, wrote a sentence that has become famous among researchers. "I will never know if she was guilty, a victim, or just the last echo of a faith that no one should carry alone." This sentence, more than any documentary evidence, captures the spirit of the Redwhisper case. History offers no answers. It offers only the uncomfortable awareness that at certain moments in history, the truth lies not in documented actions, but in the gaps between them, in what was not said, what was not recorded, what was lost forever with the passing of generations. As we close this account, we can only imagine the last days of the widow Margaret. Perhaps she walked alone through the cold hills, the little note still folded in her pocket. Perhaps she sought a place where her silence would not arouse suspicion. Or perhaps she simply wished to disappear in the same way as those who had passed through her door. There is no way to know. Holleridge today is just a forgotten spot on old maps, a place that lived, breathed, and faded away, like so many other rural villages of the 19th century. But the story of the widow Redwhisper remains, not as a legend, nor as a closed police case, but as a human record of dark depth. A reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries come not from the inexplicable, but from what is all too real. And among all the documents, testimonies, scribbles, and fragments that have survived, there is only one sentence that, when read today, echoes with the weight of time, like a last breath of history itself. They needed to learn to pray. After that sentence, the file closes, and the silence that remains seems to say everything we will never know.